The last thing my own son said to me inside the house I built with my bare hands was, "Dad, you have no place in this house anymore." He said it standing in the hallway under the same ceiling I had put up beam by beam after work, after double shifts, after years of coming home with sawdust in my hair and pain in my shoulders. He said it while my late wife's picture was still on the wall behind him, while my boots were still by the door, while the air still smelled faintly of the chili I'd made that night because he used to love it when he was a boy. I remember looking at him for a long second, waiting for the corner of his mouth to twitch, waiting for him to laugh and say he was angry, that he did not mean it. But he did not laugh. My son Ethan had his jaw set the way his mother used to set hers when she was trying not to cry. He was 34 years old, wearing a shirt that probably cost more than my first monthly mortgage payment ever did, and he looked at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into the wrong home. Beside him stood his wife Vanessa, arms folded, lips pressed tight, eyes cold and bright like sharpened glass. I had a paper bag in one hand with the prescription cream I had bought for my knees and a loaf of bread in the other. I was coming back from the pharmacy. I had no idea that by the end of the evening, I would be carrying only one small duffel bag and the last photograph of my wife, Linda. Ethan pointed toward the front door. "You heard me," I said. "This is my house." Vanessa gave a little laugh, not loud, just enough to sting. "Not anymore, Daniel. Not the way things are now." I felt something in me go quiet. Not broken, not dramatic, just quiet, like a room after the last person leaves. I asked him, "What did you do?" He did not answer right away. He glanced at Vanessa, and I saw it then. Not just anger, fear, shame. A man doesn't look to his wife before answering his father unless there is already a lie sitting between them. Ethan crossed his arms. "You can stay somewhere else for a while." I stared at him. "Where?" He shrugged. "The apartment complex on Maple has openings. Or Frank might let you crash on his couch." Frank was my oldest friend. Ethan knew Frank would take me in. That was the point. He was pushing me somewhere small enough that my leaving would be easy. Vanessa took one step closer and lowered her voice like she was being generous. "We need space, Daniel. This house needs to move forward." Move forward. Like I had become something from the past that had outlived its usefulness. I looked at the living room, at the lamp Linda had picked out, at the dent in the wall Ethan made when he was 16 and tried to carry a bicycle up the stairs too fast, at the little wooden shelf I had built in the hallway after she died, because I could not stand to look at all the empty space. Then I looked back at my son. "Ethan," I said, "tell me the truth. Did you sign something?" His eyes slid away. That was all the answer I needed. I left that night because if I had stayed, I would have said things a father should never have to say to his own child. I left because Linda raised me to know that pride can keep a man alive or kill him depending on how tightly he holds it. I left because when your own son looks at you like a burden, you either start shouting or you start surviving. And I had a feeling surviving was going to require more strength than shouting ever would. By midnight, I was in a tiny furnished apartment above a bakery on the east side of town, sitting on the edge of a bed that squeaked when I moved, staring at Linda's photograph in my lap. A year later, Ethan was crying at my door. But to understand why, you need to understand what happened before that night. Because betrayal does not usually arrive all at once. It comes in little polite steps, wearing familiar shoes. Ethan was a good boy once. I know every father says that. They say it because they want to protect the memory of the child before the world got to him. But mine truly was a good boy. He used to carry groceries without being asked. He used to run to the truck when Linda called from the porch. He used to fall asleep with his hand around my finger when he was small. And even when he got older, even when he grew taller than me, he never used to speak to me without looking me in the eye. Linda used to say he had my stubbornness and her soft heart, which, if you knew both of us, was a dangerous combination. We lived in a brick house on Briar Lane in Dayton, Ohio. Nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a kitchen that always smelled a little like coffee no matter how much I cleaned it, and a backyard where Linda planted tulips every spring, even though the squirrels kept digging them up. We bought that house when Ethan was 7. I was a foreman at a construction company back then, and Linda worked part-time at the library while taking care of our son and making sure I remembered birthdays, dentist appointments, school papers, and the fact that men like me sometimes need a shove to stop and feel anything. That house was not just a house. It was years of overtime. It was my wife standing beside me with a flashlight while I patched a leak in the roof in the rain. It was Ethan on the living room floor with toy trucks and model dinosaurs. It was Christmas mornings with cheap wrapping paper and too much cinnamon. It was the place Linda took her last breath, in the room across from the kitchen, holding my hand and telling me not to let the house make me lonely. That was 3 years before Ethan came back. He had moved to Chicago after college. He called on holidays, came by maybe twice a year, and when he did, he always had a newer watch, a sharper haircut, and a little too much confidence for a man who still had the same credit card debt problems he did at 25. Linda adored him. She bragged about him to everyone. "My boy works in finance," she'd say, though I think even she had only a vague idea what that meant. She just liked saying it because it sounded secure. When she got sick, Ethan came home more often. He sat in the hospital room with me, brought takeout, held Linda's hand while she slept. After she died, he hugged me hard enough to crack something in my chest and told me he would come by more. He said he wanted to be around. He said family had to stick together. For a while, he did. Then he met Vanessa. I remember the first time he brought her over. She was pretty in the way expensive things are pretty, polished and aware of it. She smiled without showing much warmth, shook my hand just long enough to be polite, and glanced around the house like she was calculating what could be updated. Linda had a habit of noticing things about people that I didn't. She used to tell me, "You think kindness is enough to spot a good heart? It isn't. Watch how people look at what doesn't belong to them." I thought about that the whole evening. Vanessa talked a lot about future plans. She had a way of inserting "we" into every sentence before they were even married. "We're looking at neighborhoods. We're thinking of investments. We'd love a bigger place someday." She sounded like she had already built her life in advance and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. I didn't dislike her at first. I just did not trust her. There is a difference. Ethan and Vanessa got married 6 months later in a small ceremony at a winery outside the city. Ethan asked if he could use a little money from the house for the wedding, and I gave it to him because fathers give when they can, and because he said he would pay it back. Not that I cared about the money. I cared about his voice when he asked. There was a strain in it I did not recognize then. A year after the wedding, Ethan called me one Sunday and said, "Dad, can we talk?" I was in the garage sanding an old chair Linda had wanted to refinish before she got sick. That chair became my habit after she died. I'd work on it for 10 minutes, then sit down and stare at it, then work some more. It made me feel useful. "Of course," I said. He and Vanessa arrived that afternoon with 2 suitcases and a story. Ethan had lost his job. Not just lost it, as in laid off. According to him, the company was restructuring. Bonuses had vanished, and he needed a place to stay for a few months while they got their footing. Vanessa said they were trying to be smart. She said renting in the current market made no sense. And since the house had an extra room, and since I was mostly alone anyway, wouldn't it be easier for everyone if they came there for a while? I heard the words and watched the shape of them. Mostly alone anyway. Not, "Dad, can you help us because we are struggling?" Not, "Mr. Carter, thank you for offering." Just the casual assumption that my grief and my age made me invisible enough to move around. I should have said no. I know that now. But he was my son. He looked tired in a way I had not seen before, and there was a hole in the center of his face that made him look younger and older at the same time. He told me they would be out in a few months. He told me they just needed to save up. Vanessa even reached out and touched my arm when she said thank you, and I thought maybe I had been unfair. So I gave them the guest room. The first month was manageable. The second was tolerable. By the third, I knew I had made a mistake. The house changed in little ways. Ethan started leaving his shoes in the hallway. Vanessa began rearranging the kitchen cabinets because she said my system was hard to work with. She replaced Linda's flowered dish towels with gray ones, then the curtains, then the old blue couch Linda loved. It went to the curb with a shrug and a comment about opening up the space. Opening up the space. As if warmth was clutter. I began eating in the kitchen while they sat in the living room with their laptop screens and expensive wine. They spoke in the language of people who assume trouble is something that happens to other people. They talked about credit scores, market downturns, side hustles, retirement vehicles, and maximizing value. I listened without saying much. I should mention something about my son. Ethan had always been smart, but smart men sometimes become dangerous when they become embarrassed. He could talk his way through a room. He could make a bad idea sound like a strategy. He could smile while he took control of something that was never his to begin with. Linda used to say that he had inherited my hands and her patience. But I think he had inherited something else too, my willingness to work hard for the people I loved, and his mother's ability to keep her face calm while her mind was racing. He used that combination better than I wanted to admit. At first he acted grateful. He'd say, "Thanks for letting us stay, Dad. We really mean that." He'd carry groceries in from the car. He'd offer to mow the lawn. He even fixed the porch light, which I had been meaning to do for months. Then came the little corrections. "Dad, don't leave the water running so long. Dad, we're trying to save on utilities. Dad, can you maybe not watch the news so loud? Dad, Vanessa works from home, so can you keep it down after 9? Keep it down." In my own house. I started waking up earlier so I could make coffee before they came downstairs. I stopped using the dining room because Vanessa had turned it into a home office with a glossy new desk and a whiteboard covered in deadlines. My chair in the living room got covered with one of her decorative throws, which was just a blanket no one was allowed to sit on. Linda would have laughed at that if she'd been alive. She believed in using things. A house should look lived in, she used to say. Not staged like a magazine ad. But Linda wasn't there anymore. And grief has a strange way of making a man tolerant of disrespect because he's already used to swallowing pain. The first real break came over the garage. I had always kept my tools there. Old wrenches, sockets, a drill from the 90s that still worked like a beast, a circular saw, ladders, boxes of nails and screws, and the rolling toolbox my coworkers had chipped in to buy me when I retired. That garage was my second home. I fixed neighbors' lawnmowers in there. I repaired a broken cabinet for Mrs. Haskins down the street. I built a birdhouse every spring for Linda's tulips because she liked having something cheerful near the garden. One Saturday morning, I went out there and found my toolbox pushed against the back wall, half the drawers open, and several things missing. Not misplaced, missing. I found a receipt on the workbench from a pawn shop across town. My hands started shaking before I even picked it up. The receipt listed a cordless impact driver, my table saw blade set, and a new digital level I had bought only 2 months earlier. Beneath it was Ethan's signature. I stood there staring at that paper so long the numbers blurred. When I walked back into the house, Ethan was in the kitchen making eggs. I held up the receipt and asked him, "What is this?" He barely looked up. "What's it look like?" "It looks like you pawned my tools." He sighed. The tired, irritated sigh of a man asked to explain something to someone he considered slow. "I needed some cash. We're covering a lot of expenses right now. You sold my tools without asking me? We were going to replace them. With what money?" He turned off the stove and finally looked me in the eye. "Dad, don't make this into a moral issue." That sentence hit me harder than if he had shouted. "Don't make this into a moral issue," I said. "Those tools were mine. You barely use them. I use them every week. Not enough to matter." I could not believe what I was hearing. Not enough to matter? Vanessa walked in just then, sipping coffee. She saw the receipt, looked at Ethan, then at me and said, "Can we not do this first thing in the morning?" That was the moment I understood something important. They weren't treating me like family anymore. They were treating me like an inconvenience with a pulse. I took the receipt to my room and sat on the edge of the bed for an hour. I kept hearing Linda's voice in my head telling me not to confuse silence with weakness. I had been silent too long. I started checking the mail myself after that. Before, Vanessa had begun collecting it to keep things organized, which should have made me suspicious immediately. One afternoon, I found a white envelope tucked behind a stack of flyers in the junk drawer. It was from the bank. My name was on it. That should have been the end of the surprise. It was not. The letter said a home equity line of credit had been opened using the property as collateral and that payments were overdue. I read it 3 times. Then I went cold. A home equity line. In my name. On my house. I drove straight to the bank with the letter and a set jaw so tight my teeth hurt. The woman behind the desk was young, apologetic, and nervous once she saw my face. She pulled up the account. There it was. A line of credit I had never applied for. Large withdrawals. Late fees. A signature I did not remember signing. I asked to see the paperwork. She hesitated, then printed copies. There were electronic signatures and a notarized form. My hands went numb as I stared at the page. The signature looked like mine, if mine had been traced by a drunk child. And the notarization date was the day Ethan had asked me to sign a few things for house insurance, because he said the policy company needed updated information. I had signed what I thought were insurance forms. My stomach turned. I told the woman, very slowly, that I had never authorized this and wanted to know who submitted the documents. She gave me a name, an online notary service. The IP address had come from my home. My home. I went back to the car and sat there for a long time with both hands gripping the wheel. I thought I might be sick. Not because of the money. Money can be replaced. But because my own son had sat across from me, handed me papers, watched me trust him, and then used that trust like a crowbar. That evening, I asked Ethan to sit down. Vanessa left the room. Smart woman. She had already sensed something bad. I put the bank letter on the coffee table between us. He looked at it and didn't speak. "Tell me," I said. "What is this?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's temporary." "Temporary. We needed liquidity. It was the best way to keep things moving. You used my house without my permission." He looked away. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "When it mattered." I almost laughed. "It matters now." He leaned forward. Lowering his voice like that made him reasonable. "Dad, you don't understand. We had a chance to invest in something. Something real. This was going to help all of us." "Invest in what?" He hesitated. That hesitation was all I needed. "You gambled with my house." "It wasn't gambling." "What was it then?" He sat back and crossed his arms. "It was a business opportunity." "Did Vanessa know?" He didn't answer. That was answer enough. The room felt smaller than it ever had. I looked around and saw little signs of people preparing to leave a place while pretending they were making it better. My chair had been moved. Linda's framed recipe cards were packed away. My mother's vase was gone. The family had been stripped down slowly enough that I had not noticed until the walls echoed. I said, "You need to put it back. We can handle it." "No," I said. "You put it back." He stared at me like I had insulted him. And then, with a patience so false it almost sounded rehearsed, he said, "Dad, you're not really in a position to be giving orders here." I laughed then, but it came out hollow. "What position am I in?" He looked at me for a second too long before answering. "You're living here because we're being generous." Those words hit like a slap. I remember the sound of the kitchen clock. I remember the hum of the refrigerator. I remember thinking about the day Linda and I moved into that house, carrying boxes while Ethan ran circles around us with a cardboard sword. I remember how she had smiled from the front steps and said, "One day this place will hold a lot of memories." It had. And now one of them was my son telling me I existed there only by permission. I should have walked out then. But I did one better. I went to see a lawyer. His name was Martin Hale. A quiet man in his 60s with silver hair and a face that had probably seen every kind of family disaster imaginable. He looked through the bank documents, then through the deed, then through my wife's will, which I had kept in a fireproof folder in my closet since the day she died. When he finished reading, he folded his glasses and said, "Mr. Carter, I'm going to be direct. Your son has done more than make a poor financial decision." I stared at him. He may have committed fraud. The word hung in the air between us like smoke. I asked, "Can he do that?" Martin nodded slowly. "People do all kinds of things when they think they can get away with it." I told him everything, including the excuse about insurance papers. He asked me if I had proof. I had the bank letter. I had the questionable signatures. I had the pawn shop receipt. He asked if I had any emails, text messages, anything showing Ethan discussing the loan. I did. There were vague messages about helping with the house and moving money around. Not enough by themselves, but enough to build a case. Then Martin said something I never forgot. Sometimes, he told me, the worst part of betrayal is not what's stolen. It's how much of yourself you gave away before you noticed. I went home with a folder full of copies and a throat tight enough to choke on. I did not confront Ethan again right away. I started keeping records, photos of the house, copies of statements, dates, times. Every small wrong became a line in a ledger. That week, while I was sorting through Linda's old storage boxes in the garage, I found something I had forgotten existed. A safety deposit key. It was inside one of Linda's recipe tins. She had hidden things in strange places all her life. Under sugar jars, inside old cookbooks, behind framed photographs. When I opened the small box at the bank 2 days later, I found not cash, not jewelry, but papers. A copy of the deed before Ethan's refinance, a handwritten letter from Linda dated 6 months before she died, and a sealed envelope marked, "For Daniel, if Ethan forgets what family means." My hands shook so badly I had to sit down before opening it. The letter from Linda was short. In her handwriting, she wrote that she had noticed Ethan had started talking about leveraging the house after he visited some people in Chicago. She said he had big ideas and a restless hunger that worried her. She said she had placed copies of important papers somewhere safe because she trusted me to love our son without being blind to him. She told me that if Ethan ever tried to turn the house into a weapon, I should not let him use her memory to do it. I read those words 3 times before I could keep going. Then I opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a printed email from Ethan to Linda, sent just months before she died, where he had casually asked whether she and I would ever consider adding his name to the deed for planning purposes. I remember the exact sentence because it burned itself into my head. It would just make things simpler later. Simpler later. There it was again, that language. The language of people who treat other people's lives like paperwork. Linda had responded in a reply I had never seen. She had written, "No, Ethan. Some things are simpler when they stay honest." I sat in the bank parking lot and cried like a fool. Not because of the money, because my wife had seen this coming before I did. Because she had tried to warn me in the only way she could. Because even dying had not stopped her from protecting me. That night I told Martin everything. He smiled once, not because he enjoyed it, but because the case had just become a lot clearer. He said the will and the deed copies would help prove Ethan knew the property was not his to use. The email from Linda would show intent. The bank records would show unauthorized use. And the forged notarization would open an entirely different mess. Then he asked me a question that surprised me. Are you trying to save your son, or are you trying to save your own peace? I didn't have to think long. Both, I said. But not at the same cost. That was the moment I stopped acting like a victim and started acting like a man who had been betrayed and was still standing. The next few months were a slow unraveling. I moved out of the house without telling Ethan where I was going. I found the apartment above the bakery because a woman named Rosa who lived across the hall knew the landlord and said the place was empty. Rosa was in her 70s, sharp as a tack, with dyed red hair and a laugh that sounded like she had survived 100 storms and planned to survive 100 more. The first day she saw me carrying boxes, she said, "You look like a man who forgot he matters." I told her that was oddly specific. She shrugged. I was married 41 years. I've seen the look. Rosa became one of those rare people who make quiet less lonely. She brought me soup the first night, then a spare lamp, then a used recliner she said looked better in my place than hers. She did not ask questions until I was ready to answer them. And when I finally told her some of it, she made a face and said, "Boys who mistake access for love always find a wall eventually." I started working again because I needed to keep my hands busy. Frank gave me a part-time job at his auto shop when he heard what happened. I had spent enough years fixing doors, framing houses, and building things to know my way around a motor if I needed to. I dusted off my old skills and found to my surprise, that there was comfort in oil stains and busted belts, and the simple honesty of a busted engine. A dead alternator doesn't lie to you. A stripped bolt does not pretend to love you. I began helping people in the neighborhood too, fixing porch rails, repairing cabinets, rehanging doors. Small jobs, honest jobs. Word spread. By the end of the summer, I had more work than I expected and a little pride I thought I'd lost. And while I was rebuilding my life in a one-room apartment above a bakery, Ethan and Vanessa were tearing theirs apart inside the house I had left behind. At first I heard it through rumors. Neighbors talk. They always do. Mrs. Haskins told me Vanessa had started having people over late at night. Frank said Ethan was trying to keep up appearances by going out in nicer clothes and coming home with the exhausted face of a man living on borrowed time. Rosa heard raised voices through the shared wall and said there were nights Vanessa's car was gone until dawn. Then the bank called me again. The line of credit had been pushed further. More withdrawals, higher payments. I told Martin. He said, "He's panicking." "What happens when people panic?" I asked. "They make dumb decisions faster." Not long after that, I got a voicemail from a mortgage officer asking for confirmation on a second refinancing attempt. A second one. My son was trying to dig himself out of the first hole by digging a bigger one. Martin filed the formal complaint. The county got involved. An investigator called. The forged notarization, the mismatched signatures, the unauthorized withdrawals, the false statements on the refinance paperwork, they all started threading into one ugly rope. Then came the part I had dreaded and secretly expected. Ethan had also tried to add Vanessa to certain property documents. Not legally, not cleanly, but enough to create the appearance that they were both managing the house together. Enough to make their story look organized. Enough to shift blame if somebody looked the other way. The investigator told me there was evidence Ethan had been talking to a developer about using the home as collateral for a larger investment package. He was planning to cash out the equity, put the house at risk, and move the money into what he called a growth opportunity. I asked Martin what that meant. He said, "It means he wanted to get rich before anybody noticed the bill." When I heard that, I did not feel anger at first. I felt something colder, disappointment so deep it had gone past pain. By the time fall came, Ethan and Vanessa were fighting constantly, not because of guilt. Guilt would have required shame, and I suspect neither of them had much left by then. They were fighting because the money had not solved anything. It had only taught them to lie more efficiently. The house began to slip out from under them. Payments missed. Notices arrived. The bank tightened. The county pressed. Contractors were called in to inspect. One of the neighbors told me they had seen a foreclosure notice taped to the front door and ripped down within minutes. Vanessa left first. I know because I saw her car packed with suitcases one gray morning as I was driving by with a load of cabinet wood in Frank's truck. She stood in the driveway, wearing sunglasses too expensive for the weather, and did not look back as she got in and drove off. I did not feel sorry for her. I felt sorry for the person she had helped Ethan become. A week later, Ethan called me from a number I almost didn't recognize. "Dad," he said, and I could hear the strain immediately. "We need to talk." "I thought we had been talking," I replied. He swallowed. "Please." The word please had not come naturally to him in months. I told him to email my lawyer. He became angry then, and anger was still easier for him than honesty. He said things about family and loyalty, and how I was making a legal situation worse than it had to be. I let him talk. Then I said, "You used my trust like a ladder. Don't speak to me about loyalty." He hung up. The investigation moved faster after that. I signed the statements. Martin handled the filings. The bank froze certain accounts. Ethan lost the house. Not just the right to live there. The actual house. It turned out the fraudulent paperwork had created enough legal exposure that the bank refused to continue working with him. The state took the forged notarization seriously. The financial loss was large enough that the county attorney got involved. Ethan was not arrested immediately, but he was served with documents, ordered to appear, and given deadlines that he could not wave away with charm. He tried to call me 3 times after that. I did not answer. Then one night he left a voicemail that sounded older than any voice I had ever heard from him. "Dad," he said, "I messed up. That was all. No apology for the first lie. No explanation. No confession of the plan. Just a man staring at the wreckage and finally admitting there was wreckage. I listened to that message twice. Then I deleted it. Not because I was heartless, because I understood something by then. You do not heal a wound by touching it every day. Sometimes you let the scar form. Winter arrived early that year, and with it the quiet. My little apartment felt warm in a way the big house never had because I was no longer sharing it with people who made it feel cold. Rosa knitted on the shared porch and complained about everyone's politics without ever fully saying what she believed. Frank started bringing me work even when I insisted I could handle less. A church volunteer group asked me to help repair furniture for families who couldn't afford new things. I said yes. My life became smaller in square footage and bigger in meaning. One Sunday afternoon, I went back to Briar Lane for the first time in months. The house looked tired. The lawn was shaggy. The porch light was broken again. The tulips Linda loved had not been planted, and the yard looked like no one had cared enough to kneel in it. I stood at the curb and felt something close to grief, but different. This time I was grieving what the house had been allowed to become, not what I had lost. Martin had told me not to go inside, so I didn't. There was no need. The place no longer belonged to the old life anyway. As I turned to leave, I saw Ethan standing at the window. He was thinner than before. His hair was unkempt. His face looked drawn, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be. Not the man he had become, just the boy. The one who once climbed into my lap with skinned knees and asked me to fix his toy truck. The one who fell asleep under a blanket while Linda read aloud from library books. The one who cried at a school play when he forgot his line because he was afraid of disappointing us. He looked at me through the glass, and I looked back. I did not wave. He did not either. Then he disappeared. The final collapse came the following spring. It was not dramatic. It was not a siren-blaring newspaper headline kind of downfall. It was more ordinary, which made it worse. The kind of ending that money always brings when it has been spent before it was earned. The bank completed the foreclosure process on the house. The county case moved forward. Ethan was required to repay what he could not repay. The developer he had been chasing vanished when the paperwork trouble became public. Vanessa, I later learned, had already attached herself to some other man in another city before the house was even fully lost. She had left Ethan to face the legal mess alone, which, honestly, fit her better than any vow ever had. The court did not send Ethan to prison. Not this time. He was ordered to pay restitution, lost his professional license for a while, and ended up taking temporary work through a labor agency. There was no triumphant courtroom scene, no handcuffs, no movie ending. Real life is stingier than that. It punishes slowly, in bills and shame and empty rooms. And then, one cold evening, almost exactly a year after the night he told me I had no place in his house anymore, I heard knocking on my apartment door. Not firm knocking, not angry, just exhausted. I opened it and found Ethan standing there with his shoulders slumped, his eyes red, and a face that had aged too much in too little time. For one shocking second, neither of us spoke. Then he looked down at the floor like a child who had been caught stealing and said, "Dad, I didn't know where else to go." I stepped aside without saying a word. He came in, and the first thing he did was stare at the tiny apartment. The second thing was notice the smell of coffee, and the third thing was notice the framed photograph of Linda on the shelf near the window. His lips trembled. I waited. Finally, he said, "I lost everything." I answered, "No, you lost what you thought you owned." He nodded as if he understood the difference now. He stood there for a long time without sitting down, and I could see how badly he wanted me to make this easier for him. To say it was all right. To say I knew he hadn't meant it. To say fathers and sons could step around betrayal if there was enough time. But I'd already spent a year learning the shape of that lie. He whispered, "I'm sorry." I asked, "For which part?" That hit him harder than shouting would have. He lowered himself into the chair by the window and covered his face with both hands. "Everything," he said. "I'm sorry for everything." I let the room go quiet for a while. Then I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. He looked up at me with watery eyes like that small kindness meant more to him than he could bear. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "About all of it. About me. About Vanessa. About the house. About everything." I sat across from him and folded my hands. He tried to speak again, but nothing came out. Then, just like that, the man who had once looked at me from the hallway of my own house and said I had no place there, broke down and cried in my apartment like a child who had finally run out of places to hide. I did not enjoy that moment. I did not feel victorious. Anyone who thinks revenge tastes sweet has never had to watch their own son come apart because of his own decisions. There is no sweetness in that. There is only the terrible relief of seeing the truth finally become impossible to deny. After he cried himself quiet, he asked if I hated him. I told him the truth. "I hated what you did," I said. "There were days I hated the sound of your voice because it reminded me of the lie. But I never stopped loving you. That was the problem. Love does not switch off just because a person deserves it to." He wiped his face with both hands and whispered, "Can you ever forgive me?" I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, "Forgiveness is not a door you kick open because you are cold. It's a road you walk when you're ready to stop lying." He nodded. He understood that too. I did not take him back into my life as if nothing had happened. I did not hand him the keys to my trust and pretend he had merely made a mistake. That would have been mercy without wisdom, and I had already paid too much for that lesson. But I did not shut the door on him forever either. I told him he could come by on Sundays. He could help me with work. He could earn back what might be earned. He could apologize to the people he hurt. He could pay restitution. He could stop blaming Vanessa for decisions he made with open eyes. He could become a man who told the truth even when it cost him. And if he couldn't do those things, then he could stay away. He cried again, quieter this time, and said yes to every condition. The months that followed were not easy. Redemption never is. Ethan came by on Sundays and did exactly what I asked, though sometimes clumsily. He hauled lumber for Frank. He sorted donations with the church group. He worked on repairs. He sat quietly while I told him stories about Linda that made him laugh and ache at the same time. He paid small amounts toward restitution, then larger ones. He got a more stable job. He learned that being useful is not the same as being entitled. He did not become a saint. I don't think people do. But he became honest. That mattered more. One spring morning, I asked him to help me plant tulips. He blinked at the bucket of bulbs in my hand and said, "Mom's flowers?" I nodded. We went to the little patch of dirt beside the apartment building and knelt there in the cold soil, like two men who had finally learned that some things grow only after deep seasons of damage. He dug. I placed the bulbs. The whole time, neither of us said much. When we finished, he looked at the empty dirt and said, "Do you think they'll come up?" I thought about Linda then, about her warning, about her letter, about the house on Briar Lane and all the years trapped in it, about how love can survive betrayal without pretending betrayal was small. "Yes," I told him, "if they're given time." A week after that, I got one final letter from the county confirming the fraud case had been closed with restitution and probation terms. Ethan was not erased from consequence, and he should not have been. Justice, real justice, is not about destroying a person. It is about making sure the damage ends where the truth begins. I sat at my table that night with Linda's picture in front of me and thought about how strange life is. She had spent years planting flowers in a yard she knew was temporary. I had spent years building a house I thought would protect us forever. Ethan had spent one foolish season trying to take what Patience had built, and it had all collapsed exactly the way lies collapse slowly, then all at once. A year earlier, he had stood in a hallway and told me I did not belong. A year later, he was standing in my doorway crying because he had learned the world is full of doors that close when you try to force them. That is the part people always get wrong about karma. They imagine it like lightning, instant, loud, cinematic. But the real thing is quieter. It is a man losing the respect he thought he could live without. It is a house that stops feeling like home. It is a marriage that turns hollow under the weight of greed. It is a mother's warning found too late. It is a son showing up at his father's door with nowhere else left to stand. And it is a father, after all that, choosing not to become cruel just because cruelty was available. I will not say Ethan and I are perfect now. We are not. Some wounds don't disappear. They become part of the map. We still have bad days. We still have silences that stretch too long. We still have to work at the kind of trust that was once taken for granted and then shattered. But there is a difference now. A real one. He knows I can say no. He knows love is not the same as permission. And I know that I survived the worst betrayal of my life without losing the part of me Linda believed in. Sometimes, late at night, I look at the tulips growing under the apartment window and think about the house on Briar Lane. I do not miss the walls. I miss the version of life we thought we had inside them. The one where my son was still only the child who ran barefoot through the grass, not the man who tried to push his father out of the family he was destroying. But then I remember the last time he cried at my door, and I understand something I could not have understood a year before. A man can lose a house. A man can lose money. A man can even lose the respect of his own child for a season. But if he keeps his dignity, if he keeps his conscience, if he refuses to become the same kind of liar that hurt him, then he does not lose everything. He just loses the illusion. And sometimes that is the beginning of peace. The last time Ethan visited, he brought dinner, stood awkwardly in my tiny kitchen, and said, almost shyly, "Dad, do you ever regret letting me back in?" I looked at him a long moment before answering. "Yes," I said. His face fell. Then I added, "And no." He waited. I set the plates on the table and said, "I regret that it happened. I don't regret telling the truth about it. I don't regret surviving it. And I don't regret giving you a chance to become someone better than the man who stood in my house and told me I had no place there." He swallowed hard and nodded. Then he sat down across from me, and for the first time in a very long while, the silence between us did not feel like punishment. It felt like a beginning. The first real sign that Ethan was changing did not come from a speech or an apology or some grand dramatic moment. It came on an ordinary Thursday in April when he showed up at my apartment with a paper grocery bag, a thrift store suit jacket over one arm, and a look on his face I had not seen since he was a teenager, caught doing something stupid and knowing it. He stood in the doorway and said, "I got the last of the restitution payment in today." I nodded. "Good." He looked down at the bag. "I also brought dinner. Nothing fancy." I let him in. He set the bag on the counter and took out 2 sandwiches, potato salad, and a slice of lemon pie from the bakery downstairs. Rosa had packed it for him. She seemed to have appointed herself unofficial judge of whether my son deserved to eat at my table, and after months of watching him show up on time, work hard, and keep his promises, she had finally decided he did. Ethan stood in the kitchen while I took out plates. After a while, he said, "I saw Vanessa." I stopped. "Yesterday," he added, "at a court building downtown." I turned to face him. "And?" He gave a tired half shrug. "She acted like I was a problem she had already solved. Told me she hoped I was doing better. That sounded exactly like Vanessa. Polite enough to escape blame, cold enough to avoid guilt. She's still with the new guy? I asked. He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. For now. Then he looked at the floor and said, "She asked if I had spoken to you." I leaned against the counter. "What did you tell her?" He lifted his eyes to mine. "That you're the only person in my life who still answers when I call." Something in me shifted then, not softening exactly, more like a knot loosening after too long. I sat down and let him sit across from me. We ate in silence for a while. Outside the window, the evening light was turning gold over the brick alley behind the bakery. A delivery truck rattled past. Somewhere below us, someone laughed. Life kept moving, careless as ever. Then Ethan said, "Dad, there's something else." I looked up. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "I found this when I was clearing out the old house storage space. It was in a box I forgot about." I took the envelope from him slowly. Linda's handwriting was on the front. For Daniel. If the house ever stops feeling like home. My throat tightened so fast I had to set the envelope down for a second. Ethan watched me, his face pale. "I didn't open it. I thought it should be yours." I nodded once and opened it. Inside was a note, only a few lines long, written years before her death. "My dearest Danny, if you are reading this, then something went wrong, or someone forgot what this home was built on. Do not let pride turn you into stone. Do not let love make you blind. And if Ethan ever comes back with humility instead of excuses, hear him out. He is still our son, even when he acts like a stranger. The house is not the inheritance. The lesson is love, Linda." I had to blink hard to see it through the tears. Ethan's face crumpled when he realized I was crying. He whispered, "She knew. She always knew," I said. That was the truth of Linda. She had seen people clearly in ways the rest of us only understood later, after the damage had already been done. I handed the note to Ethan, and he read it with both hands trembling slightly. When he finished, he held it against his chest for a moment and then folded it carefully. "I don't deserve her forgiveness," he said. "No," I replied. "You don't. You earned consequences. You're getting a chance at forgiveness only because she asked for one before she left us." He nodded like a man taking medicine that burned on the way down. Over the next few months, Ethan kept showing up. Not every day. Not in some desperate attempt to prove a point. Just steadily. He helped Frank rebuild a front porch on Oak Street. He spent Saturdays sorting donations at the church basement. He paid off one debt at a time and stopped making excuses for the ones he had created. Then one morning, he called and asked if I would come with him to Briar Lane. I had not been back since the foreclosure notice disappeared from the front door, and the bank took possession, but I said yes. The house looked almost unfamiliar without our lives inside it. The lawn had been cut by someone hired to keep up appearances for the new owners. The porch had been painted. A real estate sign stood near the curb. Ethan and I stood in front of it for a long time. "I thought this place was the thing I wanted," he said quietly. "Space, status, control, all of it. I thought if I could just get enough, I'd feel secure." I looked at the front windows, at the place where Linda used to place a potted plant every summer. And he shook his head. It was never enough. I just kept wanting more because I was ashamed of not feeling like enough. That was the first honest thing he had said to me about the whole mess without trying to make himself sound better than he was. I said, "Your mother would have told you that sooner than I did." He let out a rough breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Yeah, and she would have been right." We stood there a little longer, and then Ethan asked something I did not expect. "Do you want to go inside?" I thought about it. About the years I had spent in that house. The laughter, the meals, the arguments, the grief, the silence. About the way betrayal had changed the shape of every room in my memory. Then I said, no, I think I already said goodbye to it. We walked back to the truck together. That should have been the end of the house in our lives, but it wasn't. 3 weeks later, a woman from the title company called Martin Hale and asked about some old paperwork. It turned out that the deed transfer Ethan had tried to push through months earlier had opened a trail that led to a second person in the bank who had been looking the other way on suspicious files for too long. Not a huge scandal, not enough for the news to care, but enough for an internal review, enough for the bank to quietly fire him, enough to make me realize once again how many lives a single dishonest choice can brush against. When Martin told me, he sounded almost amused. Your son, he said, has managed to expose a whole ecosystem of bad habits. I snorted. I'm not sure that makes me proud. It shouldn't, Martin said, but it should make you feel less alone. That was true. For a long time, I had believed betrayal was a personal failure on my part, like perhaps I had missed some warning sign, or loved too generously, or trusted too easily. But the truth was uglier and cleaner at the same time. People like Ethan and Vanessa do not usually start with one giant lie. They start with small assumptions. They believe good people will hesitate. They believe love will soften the consequences. They believe shame is temporary and memory is weak. They were wrong. One rainy evening in June, Ethan came by with a toolbox and said he wanted to fix the loose railing outside the apartment building. I handed him the screws and watched him work in the drizzle. From the second-floor window, Rosa called down, "Don't you dare fall off that thing. I like my neighbors alive." Ethan looked up and smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Rosa pointed a finger at him. "You're improving." He laughed then. For real. I leaned against the doorframe and let myself feel something I had not expected to feel anymore. Cautious peace. Not happiness, exactly. That would have been too neat. But peace, yes. The kind that arrives when a storm has passed and the damage is visible, but the sky has stopped threatening you. Later that night, after Ethan left, I sat alone with Linda's note and read it again. The line that stayed with me was not the one about the house. It was the one about the lesson. The house is not the inheritance. The lesson is. I had spent so many years thinking inheritance meant property, money, furniture, titles, names, on paper. But real inheritance is not what you leave behind in a bank account. It is what survives in the people who remember how you lived. Linda had left me patience, caution, and a stubborn unwillingness to let bitterness become my identity. She had left Ethan something too, though he had to lose almost everything before he could finally see it. By the end of that summer, Ethan asked if we could start repairing old furniture together as a side project. Not flipping, not reselling, repairing. He said he wanted to learn how to restore things instead of exploiting them. It sounded like a small thing. It wasn't. The first chair we fixed was the one Linda used to sit in by the window when she was reading. The frame had loosened over time, and one leg had cracked. Ethan sanded it carefully. I glued and clamped. When we finished, he ran his hand over the wood and said, "It's strange. Fixing something this old feels harder than buying something new." I smiled. "That's because buying is easy. Restoring takes respect." He nodded slowly. And there, in that little apartment, with the rain tapping the window and a repaired chair sitting between us like proof, I realized something else. Karma had not come for Ethan in the loud movie-style way people like to imagine. It came as humility. It came as labor. It came as the death of his illusion that he could take whatever he wanted without paying for it. It came as having to stand in the very life he had damaged and accept that everything precious now had to be earned back, one honest choice at a time. That is the kind of justice life actually delivers. Not always pretty, not always fast, but real. Years from now, I do not know if Ethan and I will be as close as we once were, or if closeness will always carry the memory of what happened. I do know this. He no longer speaks to me like a man asking permission to exist. He speaks to me like a son who understands he nearly lost the only person who ever loved him without condition. And I no longer see him only as the boy who broke my heart. I see the man who finally stood at my door without excuses. That matters, because sometimes the deepest revenge is not destruction. Sometimes it is survival. Sometimes it is watching the person who thought they could cast you out come back humbled by the consequences of their own cruelty. And sometimes, if the world is feeling especially fair, it is getting to answer the door a year later and see that same person crying, not because they are forgiven, but because they finally understand what they broke. That was the real end of the story. Not the house, not the money, not the lawsuit. The end was the moment my son learned that love is not ownership, and a father's place is not something you can erase just because you got greedy. The end was the moment he finally said the words I had waited a year to hear, and meant them. I was wrong, and for the first time in a very long while, that was enough to let the pain breathe. The strange thing about peace is that it does not always arrive quietly. Sometimes it knocks first. About 2 weeks after Ethan and I finished repairing the old chair, I got a call from a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me said to answer. It was Vanessa. Her voice was tight, polished, and irritated, in the way some people sound when they are pretending not to be afraid. She said she needed to talk to me. I asked why. She said it was about Ethan. I almost laughed at that, because Ethan had spent the better part of a year trying to untangle himself from her shadow, and now she suddenly wanted to discuss him with me like we were old friends. I don't think we have anything to say to each other, I told her. She exhaled sharply. That's not true, Daniel. I said nothing. Then she lowered her voice and said something that made my hand tighten around the phone. If your son keeps pushing this, he's going to drag a lot of people down with him. I closed my eyes for a second. So that was it. Not an apology. Not guilt. Leverage. Vanessa, I said, whatever you're trying to do it without my name in your mouth. It's not that simple. It is for me. She went quiet, and I could hear traffic behind her. Maybe a street corner. Maybe a parking lot. Then she said the one thing I had not expected. He told them everything. I did not answer. He told the investigators everything about the money, the papers, the plan, she said. And now they're asking questions that are not good for me. I leaned back against the kitchen counter. There was no shock in me left by then, only a cold kind of recognition. Ethan had finally chosen the one thing he should have chosen much earlier, the truth. He should have done that sooner, I said. A bitter laugh came through the line. That's easy for you to say. No, I replied. It's easy for me to hear. She did not like that. I could tell. People like Vanessa do not enjoy conversations they cannot steer. You think you won because he came crawling back to you? She said. I looked over at the little table by the window, where Linda's photo sat beside a ceramic mug. The afternoon light was pale and soft. Rosa was probably downstairs complaining to somebody about the weather. Life, in its ordinary stubborn way, was continuing. I didn't win anything, I said. I got my life back, she scoffed. That house should have belonged to him. That sentence, more than anything else, lit a match inside me. No, I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. That house belonged to my wife's memory. to the years I worked myself raw, and to the child we raised. It was never a prize to be claimed because he wanted to look successful. There was a pause. Then, very carefully, she said, "You don't know the whole story." That made me laugh once, short and sharp. "That is the one thing I do know about you. You always think there's another story." She hung up. I stood there holding the phone for a long time before setting it down. That night, Ethan came over later than usual, carrying a paper folder in one hand and wearing the same jacket he had worn the first time he had brought me dinner after the restitution payment. He looked tired. Not physically tired, though he was that too. More like a man who had spent the day standing in the wreckage of his own decisions and found no angle from which to flatter them. He noticed my face immediately. "What happened?" he asked. "Vanessa called." He stopped in the doorway. I watched the truth spread across his features. The tension in his shoulders. The short breath. The way his jaw tightened the second he realized she had reached me. "What did she want?" he asked. I kept my voice calm. "To warn me, I think. Or threaten me. It depends on how generous you feel." He dropped the folder onto the table and rubbed a hand over his face. "I shouldn't have left her name off the filings," he muttered. That surprised me. I looked at him. "You did what?" He shook his head and sat down hard in the chair by the window. "The investigator found more. Stuff I didn't even know she'd done. She set up some of the accounts using names from her family. A fake consulting agreement. Money moved through places I never saw." I stared at him. He looked up quickly, like he was bracing for my anger. I know how it sounds." "How it sounds," I repeated. "Ethan, how it sounds is less important than what it means." He nodded once. "It means she wasn't just helping me. She was using the whole thing to cover herself." There it was, the last piece of the puzzle settling into place. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I had spent so much time imagining the betrayal as something simple, my son choosing greed, his wife encouraging it, that I had not considered the possibility that Vanessa had been the engine and Ethan the driver, each one thinking they could outlast the other, once they were far enough down the road. He swallowed. "I'm not saying I was innocent." "No," I said. "You're not allowed to say that anymore." He nodded. "I know." The papers he had brought turned out to be copies of documents from his attorney. Vanessa had been subpoenaed. More accounts had surfaced. There were messages, transfer records, and one terrible chain of emails showing she had pushed Ethan to use the house as leverage, while quietly planning how to protect herself if it all came apart. She had been careful, but not careful enough. I remember staring at the pages and feeling a deep, sour disappointment that had nowhere left to go. There are betrayals that hurt because someone you love chose themselves over you. And then there are betrayals that hurt because the person you loved was never as alone in the choice as you wanted to believe. That was Vanessa. She had not simply encouraged Ethan. She had shaped him, praised the worst instincts when they served her, mocked the weakness she had first pretended to adore. And when the walls began to close in, she had done what people like her always do. She reached for an exit and left someone else standing in the fire. A week later, Ethan told me he was meeting with the county investigator again. "Do you want me there?" I asked. He hesitated. "Maybe not this time." I nodded. That was fair. Before he left, I handed him the folded copy of Linda's note. He stared at it for a second, then looked at me. "You still carry that?" "Yes." He accepted it carefully, like something breakable. At the door, he paused and said, "I used to think being your son meant I could always come back." I waited. He looked at me with eyes that had finally learned how heavy truth could be. "Now I know it means I have to be worthy of coming back at all." I did not answer right away. Then I said, "That's a better understanding than the one you had." He gave a small, tired smile. The case moved again after that, faster than before. Ethan cooperated. Fully this time. He gave statements that tied Vanessa to the hidden transfers, the side agreements, and the pressure campaign around the house. I did not enjoy hearing every detail. There is a point at which accountability stops sounding like justice and starts sounding like a family being dismantled in a room with fluorescent lights. But it needed to happen. Because some people only tell the truth once they realize the lie no longer protects them. Vanessa tried to fight it at first. She denied, deflected, and blamed Ethan in a flurry of carefully chosen words that sounded polished enough to fool anyone who wanted to be fooled. But the records did not care how elegant she sounded. The records were patient. So was the investigator. So was the judge. The result was not dramatic, just final. She was forced to repay what could be traced back to her, lost her position at the firm she had been quietly using as a shield, and had to answer questions in a way that made it impossible to remain the controlled, spotless version of herself she liked presenting to the world. The circle of people she had impressed shrank quickly once she was no longer useful. That part, I admit, gave me a grim sense of balance. Not joy, not victory, balance. Meanwhile, Ethan kept showing up. By then, he had stopped asking for reassurance and started asking for work. Real work. He wanted things to repair, things to clean, things to rebuild that did not come with shortcuts or tricks. He spent weekends helping Frank at the shop, took on extra hours delivering equipment, and began paying more than the minimum on everything he owed. One Saturday, he brought over a stack of old photographs he had found in a box from the storage unit. There were pictures of Linda, me, Ethan at 8 years old with a missing front tooth and ketchup on his chin, a summer barbecue in the backyard, Christmas by the tree with cheap wrapping paper and crooked bows. I had not seen some of those in years. He set the stack on my table and said, "I thought maybe you'd want these." I looked through them one by one, and there, in the middle of all those frozen moments, was the life we had once lived without knowing how fragile it was going to become. Ethan watched me carefully while I looked. "I didn't know back then," he said softly, "how much we already had." I nodded. "That's usually how people learn." He looked ashamed. "I know." Then he said something I will never forget. "I thought love was something you could spend and still keep, like money. But it isn't. It's more like trust. You spend it wrong and suddenly everybody feels poor." That was the most honest sentence he had spoken in a year. I looked at him across the table, and for the first time since everything fell apart, I believed he understood what he had done, not just as a mistake, but as a loss of moral sight. Summer brought heat and long evenings and a few small victories. The apartment building's landlord finally replaced the broken front steps, which meant Rosa stopped grumbling every time she carried groceries up from the sidewalk. Frank gave me a steady part-time schedule. Ethan got cleared for more stable work once his own financial mess settled enough that people stopped avoiding his calls. He was not respected in the old circles anymore. Not really, but that turned out to be a gift. It stripped away the people who had only ever liked him when he looked useful. One evening in late July, I found him sitting on the curb outside the building, staring at his hands. I sat beside him. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I had a dream about the old house." I waited. "I was standing in the kitchen," he said, "and I kept trying to unlock the front door from the inside, but it wouldn't open. I could hear you outside. You kept knocking, and I knew if I opened it, everything would change." That made me glance at him. He kept looking at his hands. Then I realized I had locked myself in. I let the silence sit for a while before I answered. "Sounds about right." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Yeah." Then he turned toward me, his eyes wet again, but steadier this time. "I used to think the punishment was losing the house," he said. "But that wasn't it." "No?" He shook his head. The real punishment was knowing I became the kind of man who could say those things to you. I looked at him carefully, because that kind of sentence can either be the beginning of change or just another way to sound remorseful. But Ethan was past sounding impressive. He had no interest left in the performance. He just looked tired enough to be sincere. I said, "Then let it stay a punishment long enough to teach you something." He nodded, and then, because life refuses to let anything become purely solemn, Rosa came stomping out the front door and called, "If you two are going to brood on my stoop, at least move over so I can water the plants." Ethan laughed, and I laughed too. It was small, but it mattered. By fall, the last of the major paperwork was closed. The restitution plan remained. The court dates were done. The investigators moved on. The bank corrected the record. A quiet notice went out to the small group of people who needed to know that the property fraud had been resolved, and with it the illusion that Ethan had somehow been the victim of a misunderstanding instead of the architect of his own downfall. I thought that might be the end of the whole ugly business. It wasn't. One cool morning, a man from the title company called me and said there was one last issue involving some old signatures and a lien that had been improperly filed years earlier, before Linda died. It turned out that in the middle of all Ethan's wrongdoing, some of the original mess had exposed a separate error that had sat untouched for far too long. Because of that, I was able to recover a small amount of money that had been overcharged against the house years ago. It wasn't a fortune. Not even close. But it was enough to cover repairs on the apartment, replace the old truck Frank had been patching together, and set up a savings account in Linda's name for a memorial scholarship the church had suggested. When I told Ethan, he looked stunned. "You're giving it away?" I shrugged. "No, I'm putting it somewhere. It won't be used to hurt anybody." That seemed to land on him in a way I did not need to explain. He sat there a minute and said, "I've been thinking about what I want to do long term." I raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" He nodded. "I don't want to work in finance anymore. I don't want to be around people who call exploitation strategy. I was thinking maybe I could apprentice with Frank more seriously, or maybe eventually start my own repair work. Something real." I looked at him. He held my gaze, steady this time. "No shortcuts?" I asked. He shook his head. "No shortcuts." I believed him, not because he had become perfect. He hadn't. But because he had finally learned that character is not something you talk about when it suits you. It is what remains after your lies stop working. The first time he spent a full day helping me restore one of Linda's old cabinets, he grew impatient with a warped hinge and swore under his breath. Then he caught himself, set the screwdriver down, and laughed at himself. "What?" I asked. "I was just thinking," he said. "This would have been easier if I'd just bought a new one." I raised an eyebrow. "And?" He looked at the cabinet, then at me, and then it wouldn't be this one. That was another moment I tucked away, because that was what he was starting to understand. The point was not whether we could replace what had been broken. The point was whether we had the patience to restore what still had value. A few weeks later, Vanessa tried to contact me again. This time she left a voicemail. Her voice was flatter than before, more brittle. She said she had heard I was helping Ethan settle things. She said there were things I still did not understand. She said if I ever wanted to know the full story, she was prepared to talk. I listened to the message twice, then deleted it. Not because I was afraid of what she might say, but because I already knew enough. Some people use full story the way others use perfume. They wear it when they want you close enough to inhale the lie. I was done breathing it in. In the end, the only real closure came from a thing so ordinary I almost missed its weight. It happened on a Sunday evening at the end of October. Ethan and I had spent the afternoon at the church basement sorting donated coats for the winter drive. We were tired, dusty, and hungry. Rosa invited us upstairs for soup. Frank came by too, carrying bread. We sat at the little kitchen table in Rosa's apartment, all four of us, eating from mismatched bowls while the wind banged against the window. At one point, Rosa looked at Ethan over the rim of her glasses and said, "You know, I'm still not convinced you're fully redeemed." Ethan smiled weakly. "Fair." She pointed her spoon at him. "But you are less stupid than you were." Frank snorted into his soup. Ethan looked down, then smiled in a way I had not seen from him in a long time. Not polished, not defensive, just human. After dinner, he walked me home. The streetlights were already on. The leaves had started to gather along the curb. We got to my building and stopped under the awning. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and looked at the ground. "Dad?" "Yeah?" He hesitated, then said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I was quiet for a moment. Then I answered, "I did give up on who you were pretending to be." He nodded, absorbing that. "And," I added, "I did not give up on the possibility that you could become someone else." He looked up at me then, eyes shining again, but not breaking this time. "I'm trying, I know," I said. He gave a small, grateful breath, and then did something simple. He hugged me. Not desperate, not clinging. Just a real, careful hug between two men who had both learned that the hard way. When he stepped back, he wiped his face with the heel of his hand and laughed softly at himself. "What?" He shook his head. "A year ago, I was standing in your house telling you you had no place there." I watched him. He looked right back at me and said, "Now I know I had no place there because I had made myself unworthy of the room." I put a hand on his shoulder. "That's the first thing you've said that sounds like the truth from the inside." He nodded. Then he left me at the door, and I stood there, watching his back disappear down the sidewalk under the amber streetlights. I thought about the old house one last time that night. Not with bitterness, not even with sadness, really. Just with clarity. It had been the place where I raised my son. It had been the place where I lost my wife. It had been the place where my own child tried to erase me. And it had also been the place where the lie finally came apart. In a strange way, I realized it had done its job. It had held the years that mattered. It had witnessed the betrayal. And then it had been handed over to consequences. That was enough. People often ask, in one way or another, whether forgiveness means forgetting. It does not. Forgiveness means refusing to let someone else's worst choice become the only story you live inside. It means choosing a future that is not built entirely around the wound. That is what I chose. And Ethan, to his credit, chose something too. He chose to stay in the room after the shame arrived. He chose to face the people he hurt. He chose to work. He chose honesty. Finally, when it was no longer convenient. He chose to learn that a father's love is not a trophy to be won, but a trust to be protected. Not everyone gets that chance. Not everyone takes it. He did both. So when I think back on the day he told me I had no place in his house anymore, I no longer hear it as the final word. I hear it as the beginning of the lesson. And when I think of the day he came to my door crying a year later, I no longer see weakness. I see consequence. I see humility. I see a man who was forced to look directly at the damage he made and finally admit that the person he had tried to push out of his life was the only one who never truly left him. That is the part that stays with me. Not the house, not the money, not the humiliation. The truth. Because truth, once it arrives, does not need to shout. It just stands there until the lies run out of room. The truth, once it arrives, does not need to shout. It just stands there until the lies run out of room. That line stayed with me long after Ethan had gone home that night. I sat in my little apartment with the lights low, the kettle cooling on the stove. and Linda's photograph watching me from the shelf as if she were still keeping score on all of us. There are some evenings when silence feels empty, and there are others when silence feels full enough to hold a man together. That was one of the second kind. For the first time in a long time, I slept through the night. Not because my life was fixed. It wasn't. Not because everything was forgiven. It wasn't. But because the worst part of betrayal had already happened, and the rest was just living through what came after. That spring, Ethan started coming by with a notebook. At first I thought it was for work notes, something practical, maybe job leads or repair measurements. But one afternoon I asked him what he kept writing down, and he held the notebook up with a half smile that looked almost embarrassed. "Things I don't want to forget," he said. I glanced at it. "Like what?" He shrugged. "Like what tools Frank uses for what kind of fixes. Which suppliers are honest. What jobs actually matter to people. Stuff I wish I'd known earlier." I nodded. That sounded like him now. Still trying to assemble a life, but doing it with both hands instead of shortcuts. He flipped the notebook open and showed me a page where he had written in plain block letters, "Don't confuse control with security." Beneath it, in smaller writing, he had added, "Dad said this." I looked at him and shook my head. "You putting my words in a notebook now?" He gave a small grin. "You say a lot of things that come back later." That made me laugh, which surprised both of us. We weren't used to laughing at the same things yet, not really. But that's how healing begins sometimes. Not with a grand statement, but with the sudden discovery that the air can still move between two people without hurting. The next piece of news came from Martin Hale. He called one morning and said, "You may want to sit down before I tell you this." I was already sitting, which seemed like a good omen. He cleared his throat. "Vanessa has entered a cooperation agreement." I closed my eyes. "So she's talking?" "Yes." "And?" He exhaled. "And she's not going down alone." That did not surprise me. Vanessa had always struck me as the kind of person who would throw someone else under a moving truck and act hurt when they complained about the tire marks. Martin explained that some of the accounts, transfers, and consulting arrangements were tied to other people in the wider circle Vanessa had been using to hide money. Not enough to make headlines, but enough to drag a few polished names into a room they had hoped to avoid. There would be penalties, hearings, and likely more damage to reputations than to jail sentences, which is how these things often go when moneyed people get caught with their hands in the wrong drawer. I asked Martin, "Does Ethan know?" "He will." He paused, then added, "I thought you'd want to know something else too." Vanessa asked for a private meeting with the investigator. That doesn't sound unusual. "No," Martin said. "But she also asked if there was any way to amend the statement on the home equity line to make the situation look more like a mutual family decision." I felt my jaw tighten. Even now, there are people who can stand in the middle of a fire and still think about how to salvage the curtains. I told Martin, "She can keep trying to polish the wreckage. It won't change what she did." "That," he said, "is exactly what I told her lawyer." When I hung up, I found Ethan sitting on the old step outside the apartment with his elbows on his knees, staring at the street like it had personally offended him. He looked up when I came out. "You talked to Martin?" I nodded and sat down beside him. He let out a breath. "She's still trying to rewrite it." "Of course she is." He was quiet for a minute. "I used to think the worst part was that she manipulated me." I looked at him. "The worst part," he said, "is how much of me agreed with her while I was doing it." That was a hard sentence to hear, and a harder one to respect, because it meant he was finally looking at himself without a filter. I said, "That's where real change starts." He rubbed his hands together. The evening was turning cool. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, and then went silent. Rosa's window was open upstairs, and I could hear the faint sound of a radio playing old jazz. Ethan said, "I don't want to be that version of myself ever again." I studied him for a second. "Then don't make promises. Make patterns." He turned his head slightly, as if he were filing that away. "Patterns," he repeated. "Patterns are what people can trust," I said. "Not speeches." He nodded, and that was the end of the conversation for the moment. 2 weeks later, the city called about the scholarship fund. I remember because the woman on the phone sounded cheerful in the exact kind of tone that tells you paperwork has not yet understood grief. She wanted to confirm the memorial fund had been set up under Linda's name, and ask whether I preferred the awards to go to students pursuing technical training, family support services, or general educational aid. I chose technical training without hesitation. Linda used to say there was dignity in building things with your hands. She thought people underestimated the value of practical work because it did not come with shine. She would have loved the idea of helping someone learn a trade, especially someone who needed a start instead of a speech. When I told Ethan about the scholarship, he looked stunned for a second. "Mom would have liked that," he said. "Yes," I replied. "She would have liked that very much." Then, in one of those quiet shifts that changes a whole room without making a sound, he asked, "Do you think I could help with it?" I looked over at him. He held up both hands quickly. "Not to make it about me, just to help. With the application process, the outreach, maybe the repair work for the event space if they need chairs or tables or whatever." I thought about it for a moment. The old me would have said no just because saying yes felt too generous after everything, but the new me had learned something harder. Sometimes giving a person a useful role is better than giving them an empty chance to feel forgiven. "You can help," I said. "But you're not the beneficiary. You're the worker." His mouth twitched. "That's fair." So he did. He spent days at the church hall fixing broken benches, repainting trim, and patching a warped side door that had never closed properly. He did it without an audience, without asking for credit, and without trying to turn kindness into a performance. That mattered more to me than anything else he had done so far. On the night of the scholarship dinner, the room was modest. Folding tables, paper plates for the first round, coffee that tasted better because it was served by people who cared. Rosa came dressed like she was attending a royal ceremony, which she claimed was not for vanity, but because if you're going to raise money, at least look like the money had manners. Frank came too, wearing a tie I had never seen before, and spent the first 10 minutes pretending he had not dressed up while clearly hoping someone would notice. I stood at the back of the room as the first student recipient came up to speak. A young woman from just outside the city, hands nervous, voice shaking a little, talked about growing up around broken cars and learning to repair them with her uncle. She wanted to become an electrician. She said the fund gave her enough to start. I don't know why that got to me the way it did, but it did. Maybe because it was proof that the years we spent in pain could still end in something useful. Maybe because it sounded like Linda's kind of legacy. Maybe because I could feel her in the room the whole time, not as a ghost or a fantasy, but as a presence in every decision that had led here. After the speeches, Ethan came over and stood beside me. He watched the room for a moment and then said, "I thought I'd feel different." Different how? Smug, maybe? Relieved. Like some part of this would be canceled out by doing one good thing. I looked at him. He kept his eyes on the crowd. Instead, I just feel responsible. That was good. Better than good. "Then you're paying attention," I said. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Vanessa won't be here." "No," I answered. "She won't." He gave a bitter half smile. "Funny thing is, I used to think not having her around would make everything easier. And now," he took a breath, "now I think she made me worse than I was. But the part that let her in was already mine." There are not many moments in a father's life where a son admits something like that without excuse, without decoration, without trying to soften the impact. That was one of them. I put a hand on his shoulder. That's the truth. Keep it. He looked at me then. Really looked. And I saw gratitude there mixed with shame and something like relief. Not because he had escaped consequence, because he had stopped trying to. A week after the scholarship dinner, Vanessa's lawyer reached out again. This time, it was not to bargain or deflect. It was to settle one final matter involving a small amount of money left tied up in an account that could not be released until every claim was sorted. Martin told me the accountant wanted my signature on one correction, and that after that the matter would be finished. I signed it. Not because I was being generous with Vanessa, because I was done holding unfinished things like anchors. When Martin dropped off the final copy, he lingered on the porch and said, "You know, a lot of people would have used this opportunity to crush them." I shrugged. That would have only made more of what they already were. He gave a short nod. And that's why you're standing. I watched him head down the steps and thought about that for a while. The people who had betrayed me had expected me to break into rage, then collapse into bitterness, then disappear into some smaller version of myself they could explain away. Instead, I had stayed. I had rebuilt. I had learned that justice does not always mean the loud punishment people clap for. Sometimes it means surviving with your spine intact. And yet, even with all of that settled, one thing still bothered me. I had not seen the house in months. Not since the foreclosure. Not since the lawn got trimmed. Not since the sign went up and then came down. Not since I had made peace with the fact that a home can outlast its own ownership. So one Sunday afternoon, I asked Ethan to drive me by Briar Lane one last time. He agreed without hesitation. The house had new curtains in the front window and a new family's car in the driveway. A child's bicycle leaned against the porch railing. Someone had planted flowers by the walk. Not Linda's tulips exactly, but flowers, all the same. We parked at the curb. I looked at the place for a long time. Then I noticed something I had not expected. The front door had been repainted the same deep blue Linda always liked. Ethan saw me looking. "That was the new owner's choice," he said quietly. I nodded. For some reason, that detail mattered. It felt like a signal from the universe that the house had not been erased, only changed hands. It was still a place where children would come and go, where meals would be cooked, where arguments would happen, where someone would one day stand in a hallway and decide what kind of person they were becoming. I rested my hands in my lap and said, "I don't feel angry anymore." Ethan looked over. "Good. I thought I would." He was quiet. Then I added, "I don't feel victorious either." That made him smile a little. "Also good?" "Yes," I said. "Victory is overrated. Peace is better." We sat there a while longer in the quiet, the two of us looking at a life that had gone on without us and somehow not resenting it. Then I said the thing I had not realized I needed to say until that moment. "I forgave your mother long before I understood what she was warning me about." Ethan turned toward me. "I forgave her because she loved me enough to prepare me," I said. Ethan turned toward me. "I forgave her because she loved me enough to prepare me," I said. "And I think that's what we were missing with you. Not love. Preparation. You had love. You just never learned what to do when it stopped flattering you." He lowered his eyes. "I know. So now you do." "Yes," he said. That was enough. When we drove away, I didn't look back. A few nights after that, Ethan showed up at my door carrying a small box. He looked nervous, which was new, and he said, "I found one more thing in the storage locker." He handed me the box. Inside was a small brass key, a family recipe card in Linda's writing, and an old envelope with my name on it. My hands paused. "Mom kept this separate," Ethan said quietly. "I think it was supposed to be for later. Maybe after everything's settled." I opened the envelope and found another note. shorter than the others. Danny, if you are reading this and the house is gone, remember this. What matters most will still know how to find you. Home is not where they let you stay. Home is where love tells the truth. Linda, I had to put the paper down for a moment. Ethan stood there, not moving, understanding that some things do not need conversation. At last I asked, "Did you read it?" He shook his head. "Not until now." I handed it to him. He read it once, then again. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes, but this time they were different. Not the tears of a man cornered by consequence. The tears of a man finally meeting the shape of his own life without running from it. He said, "She really knew all of us." "She did," I answered. He folded the note carefully and returned it to the envelope. Then he gave a small nod and said, "I've been thinking about moving into a place of my own." That surprised me, though it shouldn't have. The apartment over the bakery had been temporary all along. "Already looking?" I asked. "Yeah, nothing fancy. Small place, cheap enough, close to work." I considered that. He added, "I don't want to live like I'm being punished forever. But I also don't want to live like I'm pretending none of this happened." That was the most mature sentence he had ever spoken to me. I smiled faintly. "That sounds right." He exhaled, as if he had been waiting all day for approval he did not want to ask for directly. "I was hoping you'd say that." "Don't make a habit of it." That drew a real laugh out of him. And that laughter, simple as it was, felt like one final piece settling into place. Not closure, something sturdier, understanding, the sort that does not erase pain, but gives it a place to sit. So that is where the story ends for me now. Not with the house, not with the lawsuit, not with the crying at the door, not with Vanessa's polished lies falling apart under their own weight. Not even with Ethan finally learning what he lost when he thought he was winning. It ends here, with a man who was cast aside finding his footing again. It ends with a son who had to lose everything in order to tell the truth. It ends with a wife's warning surviving her death. It ends with flowers planted in new soil. And it ends with a father knowing that the worst thing his own child ever said to him did not become the last word. Because the last word was not rejection. The last word was accountability. The last word was truth. And truth, in the end, is the one thing that always knows where home is.